Hi, everyone. Before we jump into the rest of our gospel storytelling paradigm that we did last week, I want to share with you a bit just about what it means to take the posture of listening. So I think listening is very important. Listening is something that we need to do not only with others, but we need to do it with God, and we need to do it with the people around us, our family, our friends, our neighbors, and other people who don't know Jesus. We need to be able to listen to their stories. Now, listening is not as easy as it sounds. You see, we're used to talking. We're used to being the ones who gotta have something to say, or we gotta have something to do, or we're very action oriented. And the huddles are all about teaching you how to slow down and listen and process and take that posture of someone who's just there and present and listening, okay? And so I want to give you some tips to help develop those listening skills today, okay? So as someone is sharing their story, here's some things that we want to listen for. One, we want to listen to actions. Actions are things that people said or did in their story. We want to listen to emotions, the way that they felt. So when someone says, I felt this way, or this made me feel this way, that's something to listen for. Interpretations, when we take a story and we say, hey, this is what I think about it, we say this isn't right, or if only this didn't happen, or this isn't fair. Those are some things that we want to listen for. Statements about identity or self, statements like, I feel like a failure, or I feel like I'm not blank enough. Statements about our history or some of our family issues or past trauma, all those things that come up just in everyone's life are things that we want to listen for. We want to take that posture of listening. Now, how do we go deeper than that? How do we dig deeper? Well, one of the questions that we can employ is just really asking those W words, who, what, where, when, why, and how. Those are some questions we can use to be able to dig a bit deeper when we're listening to each other, especially why. Why is a very powerful question to ask, and you don't want to ask it in the sense of a toddler, like the why when the toddler's talking to a parent, but you want to just ask in the sense of knowing more, wanting to go a bit deeper than that. So we've spent time listening, and we might want to say something now. There's this natural human tendency to want to say something to it, or to actually do something about it. And I would encourage you, as you are responding to each other, there is a way to respond to each other with grace and with and with an open end to it, to make open-ended statements. And one way is to open up that conversation is just to say this: how do you feel about this when I say this? Or to say, I wonder if, whatever you want to say. And that just opens up the conversation. It gives people a chance to disagree or say, no, you know what, I don't think that actually really resonates with me, or to say, yes, that is exactly how I'm feeling. And so these are some ways that we can employ those skills into our huddles, these listening postures. Now, we've been taking you through a bunch of these different skills and tools. If I were to use the example of a huddle being a workshop, like a carpentry workshop, but I want to share with you the direction going forward from here. We've taken you through some self-examinations. We've taken you through these 4 questions of who is God, what has he done, who am I in light of that, and how am I to live? We've taken you through our gospel practices, our 4 Ds, right? And we've taken you through our gospel postures as well. Our postures of family, servant, and sent. And now we want to spend the rest of our time this fall to talk about our gospel paradigms. Now, as I said last week, you don't have to be nervous because we've actually taken you through half of these gospel paradigms already. We've taken you through the paradigm of breakthrough, which is asking the questions of who is God, what has He done, who am I in light of that, and how am I to live. We've already taken you through the gospel paradigm of identity and how we are to view ourselves as family, servants, and sent. And we are currently taking you through our gospel paradigm of storytelling. And so that's what we want to introduce for you as a group to just digest together and process together and work through together as we continue through this Huddles launch. And so all that being said, we're really excited for you, and we'll see you in a bit. So we've got Dave here today, and he's going to walk us through these last two steps in our storytelling paradigm today. And so what have we gone through so far, Dave? What are some of the steps or some of the stages within this storytelling paradigm that we've gone through? Maybe we can go through those together as a review, and then we can take on that last piece together.
Yeah, for sure. We'll jump into that plot graph, and I'll kind of talk you through that very quickly again, just as a review. But I think the important thing to remember as we're sharing our stories with one another is that, like Mike introduced with the gospel breakthrough paradigm, is that, we're kind of pressing into transformation here. This is the reason why we're sharing our stories with one another, is because we want to be able to see how God has been working in our lives, how He has been transforming us. You might have even noticed that in your stories, areas of unbelief were actually being uncovered, and you were able to uncover those yourself as you're sharing, about kind of your big story, how God has worked in your life. So yeah, you've probably uncovered some of those areas, and you've seen how God has brought healing, and so when we talk through the last two items of this plot graph, that's kind of where we're going to land. We're going to be able to see, and you'll be able to see in Mike's story, how God has brought about some healing and some restoration, and then kind of how this has motivated him to live his life. So those questions, about, the breakthrough questions about how do I live in light of this? Well, Mike's going to be able to share a little bit today about how he has been living in light of the transformation that has taken place in the context of his story. So just to briefly recap here, we started off with the first C, with creation, with the setting. So thinking about, the setting of your own story. How did things start? We move into crisis, where, in God's story, we see kind of four areas of brokenness, of crisis. We see a fracture of the relationships between Adam and Eve. We see a fracture of relationship between Adam and Eve and God. A fracture of the relationship with Adam and Eve and creation as they're expelled from the garden and now face scarcity. And then the last place we see a fracture of relationship is actually in the self. Adam and Eve no longer understood who they were as people made in the image of God. Now they were recreating themselves in their own image. We see, as we keep going through that plot graph, in the rising action, we see a whole bunch of conflict and crisis being introduced as God calls Abraham and then ultimately the people of Israel, and they still fail to become the people that He's called them to be. And so in God's story, we see all of this chaos and brokenness and things continuing until we get to the person of Jesus, and that's the climax of the story, is Christ. And Christ comes and introduces a whole new way of living into the world. He actually calls us as humans to reflect His character and priorities. When we look at who we were made to be as humans, we just need to look to Jesus. I mean, He is, as Hebrews says, the author and perfecter of our faith. He is the one who has shown us who God has called us to be. And so now we get into what are we on here? This is the sixth C.
Yeah.
The falling action, which is the church. And what we talked about briefly last week was in the falling action, the purpose that serves in a short story is that it actually enters back into the conflicts that were introduced in the rising action. And so we now get to see how, as the church, how we get to like lean into these conflicts that were introduced and start to bring healing and restoration there. And so then when you think about your own story, it's the same kind of thing. It's like, the falling action of your own story is, how have the conflicts that were introduced in the rising action of your story, how have they been, or how are they being resolved? How have you seen brokenness restored? How have you seen, healing and hope restored into your story? And so we're going to start there with Mike's story. And so Mike, you talked about in the rising action of your story, you talked about the fact that there was a fracture of the relationship with your dad.
Yep.
That has caused some significant hurt and pain in your own life. And so, I really appreciate you sharing that. Obviously, it's not an easy thing to share, and so we're going to probe that a little deeper, actually, because we want to know, how you have experienced healing. How have you experienced God's restoring work in your life?
Yeah, I think some of it is just seeing God just show up. Seeing how God has. Seeing how, just in my life, he's just really made it known to me, hey, like, even though your earthly father is flawed, and has done, like, made a mistake, for him to show me, like, that I'm still your heavenly father, I'm your perfect heavenly father, and you can come to me, you can rely on me. And so there have been so many times in my life where I've just gone through periods of loneliness and feeling abandonment, and yet God has met me in those moments, and I haven't felt alone anymore. I haven't felt like, I haven't done the pity party for myself, because I know, at the end of the day, God has my back. I think that's, and it's not all the time, I think when you are struggling with something, it's not going to be a one and done kind of thing. It's just going to be, it's probably going to keep coming up. But every time that that it comes up, like now, I find now I'm able to remember, God is there. God does love me, and He has shown Himself to me through those, just His presence and meeting me in those places, but also even bringing along people who would build into me, and people who would, godly, loving people who would really be an influence for me for good, for my life, my purpose, my calling, and just the everyday life of stuff.
Yeah. So that's really cool, because this 6C is the one on the church, and it's really neat to see how, as part of your healing, that God has revealed Himself to you as your Father. But then He's also surrounded you with people who can continually speak, into your life to encourage you, and to help you become the person that God's created you to be, and to help you move towards, healing and wholeness. That's awesome that you brought that up. So, after the 6th C of the church, we move into the 7th C, which is consummation, which is kind of like, there's some hope tied into this last C, because it's all about understanding that where our story ultimately ends, and that is in God's embrace. And so, Mike, when you think about the end of God's story, you think about, your own story now, you being restored to relationship with God. How does knowing that, that our story ultimately ends in God's embrace, how does that influence the way in which you now live?
I think to know that is the end point for me, like, and for God's story as well, it helps me to live without fear of, like, rejection, to live without, or to live knowing that I don't have to seek the approval of other people. I don't have to put all these kind of unfair expectations on people, because I do have a Father who loves me, and just I don't need to do anything to earn that approval. I think to live in light of that means really I can feel free to say yes, I can feel free to say no, I can feel free to disagree, I can also just feel free to do to be bold in what I feel God is calling me to do and what I feel led to do, rather than, like, how do I always try to defer to other people?
Right,
You know,
right.
I can live knowing that I have God's approval.
Yeah,
In those ways. Yeah.
that's cool, because as you're sharing that, it just makes me think about how you're just able to kind of lean in and live faithfully, right? Be faithful to your calling, be faithful to the person that God has made you, and called you to be, and then being faithful to the mission that He's given you. That's great. I love it. Well,
cool.
yeah, I hope that was encouraging to you guys. And you're going to be sharing a little bit more in your stories. But Mike, you wanted to bring up something else too about kind of our story telling here with one another.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing to note that in our own storytelling, even over these past couple of weeks, I've shared my big story, the big story of my life and how it fits into God's big story. But this is also something for everyday life. If you are just struggling through the conflict and the struggle of everyday life, this storytelling piece or paradigm is going to help you to understand what God might be doing or where He's working in the background. It's for those everyday moments where maybe you are experiencing conflict, maybe you're experiencing brokenness with your relationship, even with God. You're just struggling with something with God. Maybe you're struggling with something within yourself, or maybe you're just upset at what's going on in the world or what's going on in your life. This storytelling paradigm is to help you and help your huddle to process those things together and maybe see where in this plot graph you might actually be in. And then once you kind of place it in there, maybe it gives you a better sense of what God might be doing or where God might be leading to. Dave, you got anything to add?
Yeah, no, I think that's great, because if you're able to say you're in the, like to jump off your example, say you're in the middle of a conflict or a crisis, it's good to think through, like, where am I experiencing brokenness? And you mentioned, we've talked about those four areas that we could experience brokenness in our lives. But I love how locating ourselves, like where we are at this particular time, with whatever issue it is that we're facing, locating ourselves in this plot graph actually helps us to know, like you said, where God may be leading us, what our next steps might be, and how are we moving towards transformation. And we use this word a lot, the renewal, and I think that's really cool.
Yeah. So you might be in a place where you're struggling with conflict. Maybe you might be in a place where you can kind of start to see the pieces of where God is entering the picture. Maybe you're in this place where God has already entered the picture, and you're blown away, and you just want to share that with the people around you. Or maybe you're in this falling action piece where now Jesus is taking you through those things that you were struggling with before, and yet now you are finding a way to work through those things. You're finding a way to see how He's restored you and found healing in those places. Or maybe you're at the beginning of something and you're not sure what's going to happen, but you see that something might be coming, something's on the horizon. And so we encourage you to just go back into your huddles and talk about those last two steps today on church and consummation. And we hope that you will apply this gospel paradigm as you share your experiences, your everyday experiences with each other. So we'll see you next week.
Yeah, I won't, but Mike will. See ya.